Madison's hand was still raised when the room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a party winding down. The kind that falls when something irreversible has just happened, when the air itself seems to flinch. Charlotte Whitmore stood at the entrance of the master bedroom she had paid for, in the apartment she had furnished, at the engagement party she had organized down to the last champagne flute. And what she saw did not register at first. Her brain refused it the way a body refuses a blade. There's always that half second before the pain arrives. Madison. Her younger sister, Ethan's arms around her, his jacket on the floor. Not a misunderstanding, not an accident of proximity. An embrace that had been practiced. Charlotte did not scream. She did not throw anything. She stood in the doorway while the music played in the other room and the laughter of 60 guests filtered through the walls. And she thought, how long? That was the only question that came. Not why. Not how could you. Just, how long? Because the look on Madison's face when she finally turned around, that flash of guilt chased immediately by something harder, almost defiant, told Charlotte everything she needed to know. This was not new. This had history behind it. Wait. Ethan moved first. He stepped away from Madison and ran a hand through his hair, and Charlotte noticed his shirt was untucked, and she noticed the champagne glass on the nightstand, and she noticed her own hands were perfectly still at her sides. She had no idea how. Charlotte. His voice landed with the particular flatness of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head and found the rehearsal suddenly inadequate. She did not answer him. It's not, Madison started. Don't. Charlotte's voice came out quieter than she intended. Not weak, smaller than the moment deserved, maybe. But the word landed hard enough to stop Madison mid-sentence. The ring was on Charlotte's left hand, 3 carats. Ethan had made a point of telling everyone the cut, the clarity, the number. She had smiled when he said it because that was what you did. You smiled. You made people comfortable. She pulled it off now. It came off easier than she expected. Her hands were cold from holding ice water all evening, managing the party, checking in with the caterers, covering for Ethan when he disappeared for 20 minutes, and she told his business partner he was taking a call. She set the ring on the dresser, not threw it, set it down, flat, like something she was returning to a store. Then she walked out. If you've ever been betrayed by the 2 people closest to your heart, not one of them, but both, at the same time, in the same moment, then you already know what Charlotte felt walking back through that hallway. The music got louder as she approached the main room. Someone was laughing at something near the bar. A server passed her with a tray of bruschetta and gave her a polite smile, and she smiled back because her face did not yet know what her chest knew. She picked up a glass of water from a passing tray. She stood near the window overlooking the Manhattan skyline and drank it slowly. She was 34 years old. She had spent 6 of those years building a life around a man who was apparently spending those same years building something else. She had taken the smaller salary bump to stay closer to his office. She had declined the Chicago relocation offer, the one that would have changed her career, because Ethan said it wasn't the right time for them. She had written the talking points for his board presentation last March. She had proofread his emails. She had remembered his mother's birthday when he forgot. She was beginning to understand, been very busy making herself invisible. A hand touched her elbow. Charlotte, honey, you look pale. Are you all right? It was Diane Hargrove, one of Ethan's colleagues' wives, a well-meaning woman who always smelled like expensive face cream. I'm fine, Charlotte said. Thank you. Diane lingered. Is Ethan around? Gerald wants to talk to him about He's in the back. Charlotte's smile did not move. He'll be out shortly. She excused herself. She found the coat check. She retrieved her jacket. She was 3 steps from the elevator when the first sound hit. It wasn't a gunshot, not at first. It was the kind of sound that doesn't announce itself as violence until the second one comes. A crash, then shouting, then the specific pitch of a woman's scream that cuts through a crowded room the way no other sound can. The elevator doors were open. Charlotte did not get in. She turned around. Later, she would not be able to explain why. The rational move, the sane, safe, self-preserving move, was to get into that elevator and go down and walk out onto Fifth Avenue and get into a cab and go somewhere that was not this building. She had already survived one catastrophe tonight. Nobody would have blamed her for leaving. But there was a server on the floor near the entrance to the main room. A young man, maybe 22, with a tray of overturned glasses beside him and a dark stain spreading through the fabric of his white uniform shirt. He was pressing his hand against his side and looking at the ceiling with the focused expression of someone trying very hard not to make noise. Charlotte walked to him. She crouched down. She took off her jacket. Not silk, thankfully, a sturdy cotton blend she'd grabbed on the way out because the evening had been cold. And she pressed it against his side, firm and steady, and she said, "Look at me. What's your name?" He blinked. "Daniel." "Daniel, keep your hand here. Press hard. Don't move." The room around her had become chaos. Guests running, someone shouting into a phone, the sound of glass breaking in the far corner. Men she didn't recognize moved through the crowd with a controlled efficiency that was worse than panic. Panic was unpredictable. These men knew exactly what they were doing. Ethan had emerged from the hallway, Charlotte noticed peripherally. He was pulling Madison behind him, not looking for Charlotte, heading for the back exit. She watched him go. She felt something in her chest shift slightly, like a stone moving in shallow water. Not grief, something colder and more final. She turned back to Daniel. "Daniel, breathe slow," she told him. "You're going to be fine." She didn't actually know if that was true, but his breathing steadied anyway. People believe what you tell them when you tell it with enough certainty. She had learned that in 12 years of business consulting. It applied to hospital waiting rooms, and it applied, apparently, to engagement parties under siege. The noise peaked, and then, in a way that was almost more disturbing than the chaos itself, began to settle. Not because the guests calmed down, because something else had entered the room. She heard it before she saw it. A different quality of order, precise and absolute, the kind that comes not from authority shouted but authority assumed. Men in dark clothing who moved without hurrying. A phone call, brief and clipped, in a voice she couldn't hear clearly. Then stillness, radiating outward through the room like cold. She was still crouched over Daniel when the shadow fell across her. She looked up. The man standing there was not dressed for chaos. He wasn't in tactical gear, wasn't barking commands. He wore a dark suit that had probably cost more than Charlotte's monthly rent, and he was looking down at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not pity, not dismissal. Attention. The focused, unhurried kind. "His name is Daniel," Charlotte said, because she felt the need to anchor this stranger to the specific human on the floor between them. "He needs a hospital. His wound is stable for now, but it needs to be looked at by someone who actually knows what they're doing." The man looked at Daniel. Then he said one sentence to someone behind him. She didn't catch it. And two men appeared, crouched beside Daniel with practiced efficiency, and Daniel was being moved before Charlotte had fully stood up. She straightened. Her jacket was ruined. She was holding her hand slightly away from her dress, which was ivory, which had seemed like a good choice for an engagement party, and was now a terrible choice for the aftermath of whatever this was. The man in the dark suit was watching her. "You stayed," he said. His voice had a quality to it that was difficult to place, not loud, not performative. It landed the same way a period lands at the end of a sentence, just there. "He needed help," Charlotte said. "Everyone else ran." "Yes, well." She looked around the room, the overturned tables, the abandoned champagne glasses, the guests huddled near the far wall. "I was already having a terrible evening. Running felt like a lot of effort." Something moved in his expression. Not a smile. Something behind a smile. "Vincent Moreau," he said. She knew the name. Anyone who read a newspaper or had spent more than 2 years in Manhattan's business landscape knew the name Vincent Moreau. Not from charitable galas or board announcements. From the particular way certain conversations stopped when someone brought him up. From the way his companies appeared in financial reports as silent interests. From the careful, expensive distance that respectable people maintained between themselves and anything connected to him. "Charlotte Whitmore," she said. His eyes moved to her left hand, the finger where the ring had been, the slight indentation, slightly paler than the surrounding skin. She did not explain it. He did not ask. "You need to leave this building," he said. Not a question. "I'm aware." "My car is outside." She looked at him, 40, maybe 42, with the kind of face that had been lived in rather than maintained. Not handsome in a careful way, but the sort of face that did not apologize for itself. He had a stillness about him that felt different from calm. Calm was something people achieved. This was something this man was built from. Why? She asked. Because you're covered in blood that isn't yours, and you helped one of mine, and I pay my debts. He said it plainly, like a business equation. And because whoever organized this will look at the guest list tomorrow, and your name will be on it, and you shouldn't be here when that happens. Charlotte's mind moved quickly over the night. The attack, the men she'd seen, the way they moved, the network of implications. She was good at seeing patterns. 12 years of corporate strategy had sharpened that into something close to instinct. She looked at the ruined jacket on the floor beside Daniel's spot. She thought about the elevator, the Chicago offer, Ethan's untucked shirt. "One ride," she said. "One ride," he agreed. The car was black and unmarked, and the seats were leather, and there was no driver visible through a partition. Vincent sat across from her rather than beside her, which she appreciated without knowing why. The city moved past the windows in its usual indifferent way. Yellow lights, honking horns, someone on a corner selling umbrellas even though it wasn't raining. Charlotte looked at her hands. She had cleaned them on a cloth someone had handed her, but her palms still felt wrong. "The man with the ring," Vincent said. "He left." She turned to look at him. "You saw that?" "I see most things." "He went out the back with my sister." She said it the way you say something you're still in the process of understanding. Testing the words. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" "No," he said after a pause. "Not particularly, but it seemed like the correct thing to say." She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh. Her chest was so full of grief and fury and the flat, exhausted aftermath of both that she hadn't expected anything like that to find space. "He asked me to marry him 8 months ago," she said. She was not sure why she was telling this to a stranger, perhaps because he was a stranger. "I turned down a promotion in Chicago to stay, a significant one." "What kind of work do you do?" "Corporate strategy, mostly restructuring. When companies are in trouble, I figure out what went wrong and how to fix it." She paused. "I'm apparently not as good at applying that to my own life." Vincent looked at her steadily. "Or you were working with bad data." She considered that. Outside, the city continued doing what cities do, being enormous and indifferent and filled with people having their own terrible and wonderful evenings. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe." He said it without drama. "You can leave in the morning, or now, if you prefer. You're not a prisoner, Ms. Whitmore." She looked at him for a moment longer. He met her gaze without posturing. "Charlotte," she said. He nodded once. "Charlotte." The car turned onto the bridge, and the water appeared below them, dark and cold and enormous. And Charlotte Whitmore, who had lost an engagement and a sister and a version of herself she'd been carrying for 6 years, all in one night, pressed her fingers against the window glass and let the chill move through them, and told herself she was not going to cry in the back of a Mafia Boss's car. She didn't, but it was a near thing. The estate appeared at the end of a long private drive, lit from below in a way that was more practical than decorative. Large, stone and glass. Overlooking water she could hear but not see clearly in the dark. A woman met them at the door. Older, efficient, not unfriendly, who handed Charlotte a folded robe without ceremony and pointed her toward a hallway. "There are clothes in the room," the woman said. "The bathroom has what you need." Charlotte followed. The room was larger than her apartment. She did not look around it with the wonder of someone encountering wealth for the first time. She had been in expensive rooms before. She looked around it the way she looked at everything lately, structurally. What held it up? What the decisions were behind it? What it said about the person who had arranged it? What it said was, someone made choices here for function, not performance. No flowers. No art placed to impress. Books on the shelves that had been read, their spines cracked and creased. A window with a clear view of the dark water. A chair positioned to face it. She sat on the edge of the bed. The night came back to her in pieces. Daniel's face looking at the ceiling. Madison's expression. That flash of guilt going hard. The ring on the dresser. Ethan's untucked shirt. The sound of those men moving through the crowd like water through stone. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She had built something, she thought. 6 years of building. And she had come to tonight thinking she was walking into a celebration of what she'd built, only to discover that most of it had been hollow, that the foundation she thought she was standing on had been quietly removed while she was busy maintaining the walls. She was 34 years old, and she had nothing, except apparently one night of safety in a strange house that belonged to the most feared man in New York City. She took off her shoes. She lay back on the bed without changing. The ceiling was plain and white and said nothing at all, which she appreciated. She thought, "Tomorrow I'll figure out what comes next." She did not think she would sleep. She was asleep within 4 minutes. She woke up before the light came in fully. Not the slow, comfortable waking of someone rested. The sharp kind, where the body knows before the brain does that something has changed and there is accounting to be done. Charlotte was sitting up before she'd consciously decided to, her hands flat on the unfamiliar bedspread, her eyes moving across the room she didn't recognize for exactly 3 seconds before the previous night assembled itself in front of her like a case file. The party. Madison. The ring on the dresser. Daniel on the floor. The car. Vincent Moreau. She sat with it for a moment. Just let it be what it was. Then she got up, found the folded clothes the older woman had left, dark slacks, a plain cream blouse, both approximately her size, and she dressed without looking in the mirror. She had learned, over years of early morning crisis management, that mirrors in the morning ask too many questions. The hallway outside her room was quiet. The house had the particular silence of a place where people were already awake, but being careful about it, the way a hospital is never truly silent, but works to sound that way. She followed the smell of coffee. The kitchen was large and functional, and a man she didn't recognize was standing at the counter with his back to her, reading something on his phone. He heard her come in and turned without startling, the reflex of someone trained not to startle. Ms. Whitmore. He was in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been broken at least once. Not unfriendly, not warm. "Coffee's there. Mr. Moreau will be available in 20 minutes. "Thank you." She poured coffee and didn't ask questions. She was good at reading rooms, and this room was telling her clearly that questions before coffee were not part of the operating procedure here. She drank it standing, looked out the window at the water, which was gray-green in the morning light, moving in that flat, constant way that large bodies of water move when the wind hasn't decided what to do yet. She thought about what she had. Her purse. Her phone, which had 14 notifications she hadn't opened. A ruined jacket she'd left somewhere in the Moreau estate and would never see again. The clothes she was currently wearing, which belonged to someone else. Approximately $900 in her checking account that would need to last until she figured out what her next move was, because Ethan's name was on the lease of the apartment she'd been living in for 3 years. She turned that last fact over carefully, the way you probe a bruise to understand its edges. His name. Not hers. She had suggested they put both names on it when they moved in, and Ethan had said it was simpler to have just one, and she had said fine, because she was always saying fine. The phone in her pocket buzzed. She looked at it. "Charlotte, please call me." Madison. She turned the screen down on the counter and finished her coffee. But Vincent was already at the table when she found the dining room. A long room with windows on one side that let the morning come in at an angle. He had papers in front of him and a cup of coffee he wasn't touching, and he was reading something with the concentrated stillness of a man for whom distraction was a choice rather than a condition. He looked up when she came in. "Sit," he said. Not unkindly. More the way you'd say it to someone you expected to be reasonable. She sat across from him. There was already a plate, toast, eggs, something that smelled like it had been made by someone who actually knew what they were doing. She was hungrier than she'd expected. "How are you?" he asked. "Functional," she said. Something in his expression acknowledged that as an honest answer. "I had someone check on Daniel this morning," he said. "He's out of surgery. He'll be fine." She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Good." "The situation last night," he moved one of the papers on the table. "It's contained. The men responsible are no longer a concern. The guests who attended will receive a call from my attorney's office this morning explaining that the incident is under investigation and their discretion would be appreciated. And the ones who won't be discreet?" He looked at her. "They will be." She didn't ask how. She was beginning to understand that certain questions in this man's presence were not questions so much as invitations to a conversation she wasn't equipped for yet. "I need to find an apartment," she said instead. I know. He picked up his coffee. I have a proposition first. She stopped eating. Not dramatically, just went still, the fork resting against the plate. Not what you're thinking, he said, with what might have been the ghost of something dry around his mouth. You don't know what I'm thinking. You're thinking I'm about to offer you money to keep quiet about last night. She hadn't been thinking that exactly, but she filed the fact that he'd set it away somewhere useful. What are you offering? He set down the coffee. He folded his hands on the table. Not the gesture of a man stalling, but a man who had made his decision some time ago and was now simply delivering it. Marriage, he said. The word landed in the room with a weight that had nothing to do with romance. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a bird made a sound against the window, one sharp knock, and flew off. You're serious, she said. I don't make propositions I'm not serious about. It would be a contract arrangement, legal, documented, with defined terms and a clear exit structure. My legal team would provide you with full independent counsel before you signed anything. Why? The Moreau Group holds controlling interest in several legitimate companies that are structured under a family governance clause. That clause requires the primary executive, meaning me, to be legally married before the end of this fiscal year, or control shifts to a board of trustees, several of whom have been working to dismantle those companies in a way that would benefit competitors and harm approximately 1,800 people currently employed by them. She processed this. So it's a business problem. It's a structural problem with business consequences. And you want to solve it by marrying a woman you met 12 hours ago. I want to solve it by marrying a woman whose character I observed under conditions that are generally more revealing than a dinner party. He said it without sentiment, just laid it out. You stayed in a room that was actively dangerous to help someone you didn't know. You didn't panic. You didn't perform. You just did what needed doing. I might be terrible in every other context. You might be, he agreed. That's why I'm offering full independent counsel and a documented exit clause. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to consider a contract. Charlotte pushed her plate slightly to the side. Not away. She was still hungry, just enough to signal that they were in a different part of the conversation now. What are the terms? She said. Oh, his lawyer arrived within the hour. A woman named Prescott, 50s, with the kind of face that had made peace with giving bad news and moved on. She sat across from Charlotte at a different table, a smaller one in what appeared to be a study, and walked her through a document that was 47 pages long and had been, Charlotte noticed, written with an attention to the other party's protections that was not what she'd expected. She had her own counsel on the phone within the hour, an attorney named Greta, who Charlotte had used on a contract dispute 3 years ago and trusted entirely. Charlotte walked away from the table to read the document quietly and answer Greta's questions, and when she came back 40 minutes later, she sat down and looked at Vincent, who had been dealing with his own phone across the room. 3 things, Charlotte said. He looked up. The exit clause. I want it executable at 18 months, not 24. Done. She blinked. She'd expected negotiation on that one. The professional conduct clause. The language about my public behavior is too broad. I need a specific carve-out for my own business activities. Reasonable. Prescott will revise it. And I want access to the Moreau Group's current financial structure. She said it levelly, watching him. Not for leverage, because if I'm going to be associated with your companies, I need to understand what I'm associated with, and because I might be able to help. There was a pause, not discomfort, more like recalibration. Why? He said. Because I'm a strategist. It's what I do. And because... She stopped, started again. I've spent 6 years making myself useful to someone who didn't value it. If I'm going to do it again, I'd like it to at least be on paper that I have a right to be there. Vincent looked at her for a moment that stretched slightly past comfortable. Then, I'll arrange it. She nodded. She signed the contract at 11:47 in the morning in a house she'd entered for the first time the previous night, sitting across from a man whose first name she'd known for less than 16 hours. Greta, on speakerphone, said, "Call me if anything changes." "I will." Charlotte. "Yes." "I hope you know what you're doing." Charlotte looked out the window at the water. "I'm doing the thing that makes the most structural sense given the available options, that's all." Greta was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. Then, "Be careful." The wedding was 10 days later, not a ceremony. A legal proceeding with two witnesses, Prescott and the broad-shouldered man from the kitchen, whose name was Marcus and who turned out to be Vincent's head of security and the person most likely to be standing in any given doorway when something was about to go wrong. The officiant was efficient. The paperwork was signed. There were no flowers, no music, no family present, which suited Charlotte perfectly, given that the last time she'd been in a room with her family at a celebratory occasion, the evening had ended with armed men and a surgical intervention. Ethan called twice during the 10 days. She let it go to voicemail. She did not listen to the messages. Madison sent a text on day 4. I know you're angry, but you should know that Ethan and I have been in love for 2 years. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Charlotte read it twice. She noticed her immediate response was not grief or fury, but a kind of forensic interest. 2 years. And the way that number moved backward through her memory and landed on specific moments. A Christmas dinner where Madison had been quieter than usual. A birthday weekend where Ethan had checked his phone constantly and she had assumed it was work. A conversation she'd had with her sister 8 months ago, the week after Ethan proposed, where Madison had said, "Are you sure he's right for you?" And Charlotte had thought it was concern. She put the phone down. She did not respond. Moving into the Moreau estate was practical and strange in equal measure. Charlotte had few enough possessions that a single car trip covered it. Clothes, books, her laptop, the small collection of things that had been hers before the apartment became Ethan's version of theirs. Marcus drove. He did not make conversation. She appreciated that. Her room was on the east side of the house, separate from Vincent's. She had inspected this arrangement in the contract, 2 separate private spaces with shared common areas, and found it workable. What she had not entirely anticipated was the reality of occupying a space that belonged to an organization, because a house like Vincent Moreau's was never entirely separate from what he was. There were men on the property in shifts. She began learning their schedules without meaning to, the way a person adjusts to the rhythm of a new workplace. There was a rotation of 3 near the main gate, 2 near the east entrance. Marcus had a room near the main stairwell, and she could hear, if she passed by at night, the low sound of him on the phone. It was never hostile, just present. The way weather is present, background and constant and occasionally relevant. On her 3rd day, she asked for access to the Moreau Group's quarterly reports. Vincent sent them without comment. She spent most of that night reading them. The Moreau Group was, on paper, a mid-sized holding company with legitimate interests in real estate, logistics, hospitality, and financial services. 14 distinct companies. Annual revenue in the high 9 figures. Nothing that would raise eyebrows in a standard audit. But Charlotte read financial documents the way other people read body language, not for what was there, but for what was arranged to look a certain way. And what she found, working through the reports on her laptop in the East Wing with a cup of cooling tea at her elbow and the water moving in the dark outside, was a company that had a serious and specific problem. It wasn't fraud, wasn't mismanagement exactly. It was trust. The Moreau Group's public-facing companies had a reputation that trailed them like weather. Not proven scandal, not documented wrongdoing, but the kind of accumulated association that made institutional investors nervous and kept the company's legitimate business perpetually operating at 60% of its actual capacity. Deals that should have closed didn't. Partnerships that should have developed stalled. Talented executives lasted 18 months and then left for companies where their LinkedIn profiles didn't attract uncomfortable questions. She started a document. Notes, not conclusions. Questions more than answers. What is the company actually good at? Who trusts them and why? What would change if the association changed? She worked until 2 in the morning. When she finally closed the laptop and went to the kitchen for water, she found Vincent already there, standing at the counter with a glass of something amber and a phone face down on the surface beside him. I was still in his work clothes, jacket gone, collar open, and he had the look of a man who had spent the last several hours in a conversation that required him to be very careful with every word, and was now experiencing the physiological aftermath. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She got her water. He didn't move. The kitchen was large enough that they were not in each other's space, but small enough in the night quiet that the distance felt acknowledged. "The logistics division," she said. "Who runs it?" He looked at her. "Gerald Fain." "How long?" 9 years. Does he know the hospitality contracts from 2019 through 2022 have a 15% performance gap against comparable market segments? Vincent's expression moved. Not surprise, exactly. Something more interested than surprise. What do you think is causing it? I think Gerald Fain is running a division that's 20% larger than his management structure can handle, and instead of flagging it, he's been filing reports that smooth the numbers so they don't look like a problem. She paused. Which means you've been making decisions based on wrong data. He was quiet for a moment. How long did it take you to find that? About 4 hours. He picked up his glass. Fain has been with the organization since before I took over. I understand that. She held his gaze. I'm not telling you to fire him. I'm telling you what I found. Is that all you found? No, she said, but the rest requires more data. He studied her for a moment in that steady way he had. Not invasive, just thorough. I'll give you what you need. She nodded. She started back toward the hallway. Charlotte, she turned. Why? He said. The same question she'd asked him 10 days ago, across a different table. She thought about it honestly. Because I'm good at this, and I've been wasting it. She paused. And because if I'm going to have my name attached to this company, I'd rather it be attached to something I actually helped fix. He said nothing. She went back to her room. The first time she attended a Moreau Group executive meeting was 11 days after moving in, and it went the way she had predicted it would go, which was poorly. There were 7 people in the room, 6 men and a woman named Iris Chow, who ran the financial services division and who looked at Charlotte when she entered with the expression of someone doing a rapid and not particularly charitable assessment. The men were more varied in their responses. 2 ignored her with the practiced ease of long habit. 1 was overtly polite in a way that communicated its own dismissal. And the 4th, who turned out to be Gerald Fain, looked at her with an expression she recognized immediately. He knew she'd been in the reports. He didn't know what she'd found, but he knew someone had been there, and he'd spent the last week thinking about what there was to find, and his face was doing the work of a man who has something to protect and is deciding whether to be friendly about it. Charlotte sat down. She did not introduce herself. Vincent had done that briefly at the door, and she did not open with strategy or observations. She had a notepad in front of her, and she wrote things on it while others spoke, and she asked 2 questions during the first half of the meeting that were specific enough to signal she'd done her reading and open enough not to be accusations. After the meeting, Fain found her in the hallway. He was 61, heavy through the middle, with the confidence of a man who had survived multiple corporate regimes by being indispensable. Miss Whitmore. He extended his hand. His grip was firm and slightly too long. Welcome to the organization. It must be quite a change from your previous work. Different scale, she said pleasantly. Similar problems. Oh? His eyes were careful. What kind of problems? Mostly structural, she said. Companies that have grown faster than their reporting systems. Data that's accurate but not complete, the usual. She smiled. I'm still learning the landscape here. He smiled back. It did not reach anything above his cheekbones. Of course. Well, if you have any questions, my door is always open. I appreciate that, she said. I may take you up on it. She watched him walk away. She noted the slight forward lean in his shoulders and the way he reached for his phone before he'd cleared the end of the hallway. She turned around and found Iris Chow standing behind her, close enough that she'd clearly been waiting. You found the logistics gap, Iris said. Not a question. Yes. Fain has known about it for 3 years. Iris said it without drama, the way someone reports a weather pattern. He's been managing upward instead of fixing it. The reports look clean because he builds them backward from the number he needs. Charlotte looked at her. Why are you telling me this? Iris's expression was composed and entirely direct. Because I've been raising flags on the logistics division for 18 months and nothing has happened. And because, she paused briefly, because you're the first person who has come into this organization in 4 years who has actually read what's in front of them instead of what they were told to see. Charlotte held that for a moment. Can you document what you flagged, formally, with dates? I already have. Send it to me. Iris nodded once and left. Charlotte stood in the hallway alone for a moment, aware that she had just made her first ally and her first enemy in the same 45-minute window, and that Fane was almost certainly already on the phone with someone who was not Vincent Moreau. She walked back toward Vincent's office. The house, she was realizing, was not a house. It was an organization dressed as a house, with all the pressures and loyalties and old scores that organizations accumulate over time, and she had just walked into the middle of it. She had done that before. She had fixed it before. But she had never done it while the man running the organization was watching her the way Vincent Moreau watched things, like he was still deciding whether what he was seeing was an asset or a liability, and like the answer actually mattered to him in a way he hadn't planned for. The call from Ethan came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the wedding, while she was in the middle of drafting a restructuring proposal for the logistics division. She saw his name on the screen and felt nothing for a moment. Not anger, not hurt, just the flat recognition of a thing she had known was coming. She answered. "Charlotte." His voice had the quality of someone who had rehearsed this. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know. We need to talk about the apartment and other things." "The apartment is your lease. I've removed my belongings. There's nothing to discuss." A pause. "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "Are you really married to Vincent Moreau?" She had expected the question. She had not expected the specific shape of what she felt when he asked it. Not satisfaction, not defensiveness. Something closer to tiredness. A bone-deep tiredness at the years she'd spent in orbit around someone who could not help, even now, asking questions that were only about himself. "Yes," she said. "Charlotte, that man is— Ethan." Her voice was not loud. "I'm not doing this. He's dangerous. Whatever he told you, he told me the terms of a legal contract, which I reviewed with independent counsel. That's the extent of it." She paused. "You were sleeping with my sister for 2 years. I don't need your assessment of what's dangerous." Silence. Then quietly, "I'm sorry for how you found out." "For how I found out," she repeated. "Not for the 2 years." He didn't answer that. "Don't call me again, Ethan," she said. "I mean that simply. Not in anger, just as a fact." She hung up. She set the phone face down. She sat for a moment, and then she picked up her pen and went back to the proposal, because there was work to be done, and grief, she had learned, was most manageable when it had to wait its turn. But 2 days later, Gerald Fane resigned. He did it through an attorney, which told Charlotte everything she needed to know about what he'd been doing with the 2 days he'd had. The resignation letter was crafted, specific in what it claimed and strategic in what it omitted. And attached to it was a complaint filed with the Moreau Group's internal board, alleging that Charlotte had accessed restricted financial data without proper authorization during her first week on the property. Vincent called her into his office. She sat across from him. The resignation letter and the complaint were on the desk between them. She had read both, and she had noticed that the complaint contained 2 factual inaccuracies, which told her it had been written quickly. "Did you access restricted data?" he asked. "No." She held his gaze. "You gave me the quarterly reports. Those are what I worked from. If Fane filed his logistics reports in a folder marked restricted, that's his filing choice, not mine. I have the email you sent providing access." "I know you do," he said. "I sent it." She waited. He looked at the complaint for a moment, then at her. "Fane has been with this organization for 9 years and has a relationship with 3 members of the board. This complaint will go to a formal hearing unless he withdraws it." "Will he withdraw it?" "That depends." "On what?" "On what I decide to do with the information you gave me about the logistics gap." His voice was level. "Fane knows that if I pursue the gap formally, it exposes him to significantly more than a resignation. He filed this complaint as leverage. He's betting I'll let him go quietly to avoid the disruption." Charlotte looked at him. "What are you going to do?" Vincent's hands were flat on the desk. He held her gaze for a moment and something moved in his expression. Not uncertainty. More like someone choosing, deliberately, which kind of person they were going to be. "I'm going to pursue it formally," he said. "Every flag Iris Chow filed will go to an independent auditor. The complaint against you will be answered with documentation." He paused. "But I need to know you're prepared for what that means. Fane has allies. This will be unpleasant before it gets better." Charlotte thought of the forensic clarity with which she had read those reports. She thought of 1,800 employees whose jobs depended on a company that had been making decisions based on false data for 3 years. She thought of Iris Chow, who had been raising her hand for 18 months and being ignored. "I'm not afraid of unpleasant," she said. "I know that." He said it simply. "I need to know you understand what kind of unpleasant we're talking about." She met his eyes. "Gerald Fain is going to tell people I manipulated my way into this marriage in order to access the organization's finances. He's going to paint me as a gold digger with a legal strategy. He's going to go to the press if the internal process doesn't go his way." She said it flatly, without heat. "That's what he's going to do." Vincent was quiet. "I know," she said, "because it's what I would do if I were him, and I had something to lose and I wanted to make the other person's credibility the question instead of my conduct." A long silence sat between them. Outside the window, the water moved the way it always moved, indifferent and constant. "We proceed," Vincent said finally. "Yes," she said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Vincent picked up the complaint, turned it over, and set it in a tray marked for his legal team. The gesture was small and final, and it meant that something had just been set in motion that could not be quietly reversed, that the easy exit had just been passed, and that Charlotte Whitmore, who had walked into this arrangement with a contract and a clear exit clause and a plan, was now standing on ground that had shifted under her feet in a direction she had not entirely mapped. She was not afraid, but she was not certain either, and the difference between those two things was the space where everything difficult was about to grow. The auditor arrived on a Monday. Her name was Sandra Vale, and she came with 2 associates and 4 hard drives and the particular organized efficiency of someone who had done this work long enough to know that the interesting things were never in the files people showed you first. Vincent had contracted her independently, not through the Moreau Group's existing legal structure, which Charlotte had quietly noted was the right call, because using an internal process to investigate internal misconduct was like asking a river to audit its own direction. Charlotte met her briefly in the front hallway, and then stayed out of her way. This was deliberate. The complaint Fain had filed against her was still technically active, pending the board hearing, and being seen to direct the audit would hand Fain's attorneys exactly the narrative they were constructing, that she had engineered the entire situation to remove him and consolidate her own influence. She went back to her office. She had been given a proper one now, East Wing, overlooking the stone garden, and she worked. She drafted the restructuring framework for the logistics division. She corresponded with Iris Chow, whose documentation of her flagged concerns turned out to be meticulous and thorough in a way that suggested she had known, eventually, that she would need it. She read the hospitality division's vendor contracts and found 2 renewal clauses that had been structured in a way that quietly transferred negotiating leverage to the vendor over time. The kind of thing that didn't show up in a summary report and required someone to actually read the documents. She was 3 pages into a vendor contract on Wednesday afternoon when Marcus knocked on her office door. "Mr. Moreau wants you," he said. She set down the contract. "What happened?" Marcus had the face of a man who delivered news without editorializing it, and he delivered it now the same way he'd delivered everything else since she'd known him. "Fain's attorney called. He's withdrawing the complaint." Charlotte stood up. "When?" "Signed an hour ago. Formal withdrawal, no conditions." She was already moving around the desk. "Then why does Vincent want me?" Marcus said nothing. His silence had a texture to it this time that it hadn't had before, not ominous exactly, but weighted, like a room before a barometric shift. Vincent was standing when she came in, which was unusual. He was normally seated when he had difficult things to say. She had cataloged this unconsciously over the weeks, the way he used stillness as a management tool. Standing meant he was still processing. He had a newspaper on the desk. Physical copy, folded open to a page she couldn't see yet. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." She said it without aggression, just a preference. He looked at her for a moment and then didn't argue, which she also noted. He turned the newspaper around and pushed it across the desk. The headline was in a tabloid she recognized, the kind of publication that traded in half-sourced stories and photograph licenses and had a readership large enough to matter. The story occupied the top half of a page, with a photograph that had been taken at some distance but was clear enough. Charlotte, outside the Moreau Estate's east entrance, on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago. She remembered the day because she had gone outside to take a call from Greta in the afternoon, and the light had been at the odd flat angle it gets in early autumn when it lies along the ground. She read the headline, Then the first 3 paragraphs. Then she set the newspaper down. Who gave them this? Her voice came out quiet and controlled, which cost her something she could feel in her jaw. We're working on that. She read the relevant section again internally without needing to look at the page. The story described her as a former corporate consultant who had pursued Vincent Moreau deliberately following the public embarrassment of her broken engagement, who had leveraged a chance meeting during a security incident at a private event to insert herself into the Moreau household, and who had subsequently filed a false report against a senior executive in order to remove him before her own conduct could be audited. It quoted a source described only as someone with direct knowledge of the organization's internal workings. Fane, she said. Possibly. The withdrawal this morning. He withdrew because he'd already given them the story. She heard the flatness in her own voice. The complaint was a delay tactic. He needed time to get this out before the audit produced anything he couldn't manage. She looked up. When does the story hit digital? It's already there. She turned and walked to the window. Not from emotion, she needed to think without his face in her eyeline. The courtyard below was empty. A stone path went from the east entrance toward the water. She had walked it twice since she'd been here. Once in the morning when she couldn't sleep, once on a Sunday afternoon when the work had gone still and she needed air. She thought through it methodically, the way she'd been trained to think through a crisis. What was the actual damage? What could be addressed? What couldn't? The damage was this. The story had given names to a narrative that was already available. Gold digger. Corporate manipulator. Woman who moved from one powerful man to another, using each one as a rung. It wasn't provable. But it didn't need to be provable. It needed to be credible, and credible was what tabloid language was specifically designed to produce. The investors, she said. 3 calls this morning from institutional partners. My team is managing them. She turned back. That's not managing them. That's containing them temporarily. She looked at him directly. You know that. Yes. He said it without resistance. What do you want to do? She thought of the framework she'd been building for 3 weeks. The restructuring plan. The vendor contracts. The reputational gap she'd identified in the company's first quarter analysis. The way that the Moreau Group's legitimate businesses were perpetually underperforming their market segment, not because of their actual conduct, but because of what people assumed about them. She thought about how the story in that newspaper had just made the gap she was trying to close significantly wider. I want to do the thing that Fane is betting we won't do, she said. Vincent waited. I want to be transparent. She moved back to the desk and picked up the newspaper. Not defensive, transparent. Here's the contract, here are the terms, here's what I've been working on, here's the audit, and here's what it found. She set it down. Secrets are where rumors grow. You take the secret away, you take the air out of it. He was studying her with that thorough, unhurried attention. That means releasing the marriage contract. Yes. The terms of that contract are private. They're private until someone decides the story about them is more interesting than the truth. She held his gaze. They already decided that. So the truth is the only thing we have left. Silence in the room. Outside, somewhere on the property, a phone rang and was answered and went quiet. There's a board hearing next week, Vincent said finally. The 3 members Fane is connected to will use this story in that room. I know. It'll be worse in that room than it looks on that page. I know that too. He looked at her, and for a moment something crossed his expression that she didn't immediately classify. Not uncertainty. Something more specific. Something that looked briefly like he was calculating not just the strategic outcome, but something else. Something adjacent to it. All right, he said. We do it your way. She called Greta that evening and walked her through it. Greta asked 3 pointed questions and then said, This is either very smart or the thing that ends your involvement with this company. Those are the same thing in a lot of scenarios, Charlotte said. Charlotte. I know. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, shoes off, one hand pressed flat on the mattress beside her. I know what I'm doing. A pause. Do you? Greta's voice was careful, not unkind. Charlotte thought about the question. I'm doing what I always do, finding the structural problem and proposing the fix. You're also, Greta said, defending a man who runs an organization that isn't entirely above board, in a public forum, using your own credibility as the currency. I want you to understand that's what you're actually doing. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. His legitimate businesses employ 1,800 people, she said. I know. And the structural problems in those businesses are real, and they're fixable, and somebody needs to fix them. I know that too. And She stopped. The sentence had a next word, and she wasn't sure she was ready to say it out loud to anyone, including Greta. Greta, who had known her for 9 years and had the specific skill of knowing when to wait, waited. He asked me what I wanted to do, Charlotte said. Not what I should do, not what was best for the company. What did I want? She heard how that sounded. I'm not saying that means anything specific. I know, Greta said again gently. I'm saying it's not nothing. No, Greta agreed. It's not nothing. They stayed on the line for a moment without talking. Then Greta said, Be careful with what you use as currency, Charlotte. Once you spend it, it's spent. I know. She did know. She went to sleep knowing it and woke up the next morning knowing it harder, because the digital version of the story had been picked up overnight by 2 more outlets, and her name was now appearing in search results alongside the words controversy, manipulation, and mafia wife, which was a phrase that landed differently in text than she'd anticipated. She released the marriage contract terms at noon on a Thursday through a press statement drafted with Prescott's office and reviewed 3 times by Greta. It was precise and dry and contained the emotional temperature of a corporate filing, which was exactly what she'd wanted. It stated, the marriage was a contractual arrangement entered into by both parties for documented business reasons. The terms had been reviewed by independent counsel on both sides. The arrangement contained a clear exit structure, and Charlotte Whitmore had joined the Moreau Group's operational team in her professional capacity as a corporate strategist. Attached to the statement was a summary of her current projects. Not details. A summary. The logistics restructuring. The vendor contract review. The financial services reporting overhaul she had begun developing with Iris. It was the most strategic thing she'd done in 3 years, and she knew it, and she also knew it would not be enough. It was not enough. The board meeting was on a Tuesday in a room on the 14th floor of the Moreau Group's primary office building, and Charlotte walked in knowing that 3 of the 7 board members in that room had spent the previous 5 days being spoken to by people who had Gerald Fain's interests and Gerald Fain's version of events. She sat beside Vincent. Not behind him. She had been specific about this, and he had not argued. The 3 board members were named Harlan, DuPont, and Sato. Harlan was 70, with the practiced gravity of someone who'd spent a career being taken seriously in rooms. DuPont was 55 and corporate, and had the particular expression of someone who had already decided the outcome and was participating in process as courtesy. Sato was the one Charlotte watched most carefully. Younger than the other 2, maybe 48, with a quality of intelligence about her that suggested she was making her own calculations rather than running Fain's. The meeting opened formally. Reports were read. The audit summary was presented by Sandra Vale in 12 minutes of flat, documented language that described the logistics division's performance gap, the pattern of backward-filed reports, and the 3-year timeline of Iris Chow's flagged concerns, none of which had been escalated. Then Harlan spoke. Ms. Whitmore. He used her name the way you'd use a label, identifying rather than addressing. You joined this organization under unusual circumstances. Yes, she said. You had access to internal financial documentation within days of your arrival. I was given access by Mr. Moreau. That access is documented. And within 3 weeks, you had identified what you characterized as serious misconduct in a division headed by a senior executive who had served this organization for 9 years. I identified a performance gap. The audit characterized the misconduct. DuPont leaned slightly forward. Ms. Whitmore, in your previous professional capacity, before your association with this organization, you worked for a firm called Aldridge Consulting. She went still. Not visibly. But something inside her went very still, the way water goes still before it freezes. Yes, she said. Aldridge Consulting dissolved 18 months ago. DuPont had the composure of someone reading from notes he'd memorized. Following an investigation by the SEC into a client whose restructuring they had advised. That client was found to have filed fraudulent financial reports with multiple investors. Aldridge's role in the matter was, the language used was, unclear. The room was quiet. Charlotte felt the air change the way you feel a room change when the heat goes off. Not immediately cold, just different, less insulating. I left Aldridge 14 months before the investigation began, she said. Her voice was level. I was not part of the case. I was not interviewed. My name does not appear in the SEC documents. No, DuPont said. It doesn't, but the restructuring strategy that was at the center of the investigation. He paused, and in that pause, Charlotte's chest did something she did not permit herself to show on her face. That strategy was developed by a team you led. She heard Vincent shift slightly beside her. Not dramatically, a small movement, the kind that comes from controlled suppression of a larger response. She did not look at him. I led a team that produced a restructuring recommendation, she said. The client chose how to implement that recommendation. The client made decisions independent of our consultation. Those decisions were what the SEC examined. But the recommendation provided the architecture, DuPont said. That's not the same. It provided the appearance of legitimacy to a structure that was used to defraud investors. He said it without heat, just placed it on the table, like a piece of evidence in a tray. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a short time in most contexts. In a boardroom with 7 people and 20 years of power dynamics and a marriage contract that had been in the news for 48 hours, 4 seconds is a geological event. Charlotte breathed. She thought about the strategy she'd outlined with Greta, the documentation she'd prepared, the paper trail, the specific dated record she had of every recommendation she'd made and every decision the client had made independently. She thought about how none of that preparation had anticipated someone knowing the Aldridge connection and how to use it. She thought about the expression on Ethan's face when she'd confronted him in the bedroom. Not guilt. Calculation. A man checking the exits. She had seen that expression before. She was looking at DuPont and seeing it now. "Where did you get that information?" she said. DuPont blinked. It was the one moment his composure moved, brief, quickly covered. "I beg your pardon?" "The Aldridge connection. The specific framing of the recommendation is architecture." She kept her voice academic, not accusatory. "That framing isn't in the SEC documents. I know because I've read them. It's a specific interpretation that requires someone to have read both the documents and the internal team notes." DuPont said nothing. "The internal team notes were not public record," she said. "They were proprietary. They were sealed as part of the dissolution process." She paused. "So I'm curious where you encountered them." Another silence. This one with a different texture. Sato, who had not spoken, was watching Charlotte with an expression that had shifted slightly in a direction Charlotte couldn't immediately read. Harlan cleared his throat. "I think we should—" "Gerald Fain," Charlotte said, "had a consulting relationship with Aldridge in 2019. He was a client referral, brought in through a third-party logistics advisory." She had found this 2 days ago in the Moreau Group's vendor history, following the thread backward from a payment she'd flagged in the 2019 reports. His company used Aldridge for a 6-month restructuring consultation before they were acquired into the Moreau Group. He would have had access to internal correspondence during that engagement. The room was very quiet. She had not planned to say this here. She had planned to give it to Vincent privately and let legal handle the thread. She had planned, in other words, to be careful and methodical. But careful and methodical required time she no longer had, and the alternative was sitting in this room while her professional history was used as a crowbar to pry her out of a company she had spent 5 weeks actually trying to help. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not willing to do that. "I'd like to formally request," she said, "that the board's receipt of the Aldridge internal documents be added to the audit scope, because if those documents were obtained improperly, this board's use of them constitutes a procedural violation that affects the legitimacy of this hearing." Harlan's face had the specific expression of a man who had thought he was managing a situation and had discovered he was inside one. Vincent said nothing. She felt him not saying it beside her, felt the controlled stillness of a man exercising genuine restraint, which she understood was not what she'd expected from him, and which registered somewhere under her breastbone in a way she didn't have time to examine. Sato spoke. "I'd like to recess for 30 minutes, she said. Her voice had the clean authority of someone who had been waiting for the moment that the room's direction became clear. "Before we proceed further." The hallway outside the boardroom had the specific airport lounge quality of spaces that exist only to contain waiting, flat carpet, indirect lighting, a side table with water nobody touched. Charlotte stood near the window. The city was 40 feet below and oblivious. Vincent came out behind her. He stood beside her, not quite close enough to be conspicuous, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You knew about Aldridge," he said. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." She looked at him. His expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it that she hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, something that had more hurt in it than anger, which surprised her, and which she immediately recognized was going to require a conversation she didn't have the capacity for right now. "I left Aldridge because I knew something was wrong with the client's implementation," she said. "I couldn't prove it. I raised it with my director, and he said I was being overcautious. I resigned 4 months later, and I've spent 14 months keeping my distance from anything connected to that case." "That's not what I asked." "I know." She met his eyes. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know if you'd still want me involved if you knew, and I needed to be involved." She said it plainly, without apology. "Not for the contract, not for the settlement, because the problems in this company are real, and I can fix them, and I needed to be the one doing it." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression, layered and complicated and not resolved. "You should have told me," he said. "Yes," she said, "I should have." The honesty of it landed between them without softening. She turned back to the window. Below, a cab honked twice and pulled into traffic and was absorbed by the city. "Fane didn't just get those documents from an old consulting file," she said. "Getting sealed documents out of a dissolved firm's records takes resources and a specific kind of connection. That's not Fane working alone." She paused. "Someone is helping him. Someone who has reach into legal archives and board access, and a reason to want me specifically out of this organization." She felt Vincent go still beside her. "The attack at the engagement party," she said. It was not quite a question. "What about it?" "It wasn't random." She had been sitting with this conclusion for a week, moving around it, testing its edges. The timing, the guest list, the specific nature of the breach, targeted disruption, not robbery, not a statement. Someone wanted to create an incident at that event, and I ended up in your car because of it. She heard him breathe. "If someone had reason to believe I'd end up in your organization," she said, "and wanted to make sure that when I got here I could be removed." She stopped. "They needed something on me before I arrived." "The Aldridge documents," he said. "They've had them for longer than Fane has been planning this complaint." She turned to face him. "This started before the engagement party, Vincent. Whatever this is, it started before I ever walked into that building." His jaw was tight. His eyes were on her face with the concentrated attention of someone recalculating everything they thought they'd understood about the geometry of a problem. "Richard Blackwell," he said. She had not heard the name before, but she watched his face when he said it, and she understood from the specific quality of his stillness, the way certainty and fury sit in a person's body differently than suspicion, that this was not speculation. "Who is he?" she said. "An old problem," Vincent said, "that I thought was managed." She heard what was under the words. Not just an enemy, the specific category of enemy that comes with history and unfinished scores, and the long memory of men who operate in spaces where settling scores is structural rather than personal. "He used me," she said. Not a question, not accusation, just understanding, arriving in a cold, clean line. "I don't know yet how much of it was planned." Vincent's voice was very even. "But I'm going to find out." He turned toward the boardroom door. He stopped. He turned back. "Charlotte." His voice had a different register for a moment. Not corporate, not managed, just direct. "When we go back in there, what you did with DuPont's question, the Fane connection, the documents, that was—" He stopped. "Where did you find it?" "The 2019 vendor history," she said. "Payment records." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite respect, but lived in the space where those two things meet when neither of them is performed. "All right," he said. They went back in. The hearing reconvened and lasted another 90 minutes. Sato voted to expand the audit scope to include the board's receipt of the Aldridge documents. Harlan voted against. DuPont abstained, which was the abstention of a man who has realized the floor he was standing on has become unreliable. The formal vote to remove Charlotte from her operational role failed by one. It was not a victory. It was the thinnest possible margin against a move that would have made everything she'd built in 5 weeks irrelevant, and the margin existed only because Sato had made her own calculations and decided Charlotte was more useful than she was dangerous, and that was not a foundation Charlotte could rely on long term. She walked out of the building beside Vincent into the cold afternoon air and stood on the sidewalk while Marcus pulled the car around, and she thought, this is not over. It is, in fact, only at the point where it begins in earnest. She thought about Richard Blackwell, whose name she'd heard for the first time 40 minutes ago, and who had apparently been arranging pieces around her since before she knew she was on a board. She thought about the Aldridge documents, sealed and supposedly inaccessible, which someone with money and the right connections had pulled from a legal archive and placed in the hands of a board member. She thought about the engagement party, and the attack, and the car, and the contract, and all the choices she'd made since, each one feeling like her own, and each one she now understood, possibly anticipated. She had been good at reading structures. She had been good at seeing what was arranged to look a certain way. She had spent her career finding the thing behind the thing, and she had not, until this moment, turned that skill on herself. The car arrived. She got in. Vincent got in beside her, but not across, beside, which was different from every other trip in this car, and she noticed it without remarking on it. They rode in silence for 3 minutes. Then she said, "I need everything you have on Richard Blackwell." Vincent looked at her. In the gray afternoon light through the car window, his face had an openness to it she hadn't seen before. Not vulnerability, not weakness, but the specific expression of someone who has stopped deciding whether to trust you, and simply has. "You'll have it tonight," he said. She nodded. Outside, the city moved past them, enormous and indifferent and full of people arranging things and having things arranged around them. And Charlotte Whitmore sat in the back of a car that had once been a stranger's and thought about what kind of woman you had to become when you finally understood that the fight you were in was larger than the fight you'd agreed to, and there was no version of walking away that did not cost more than staying. She had the answer. She just needed to decide if she was ready to be that woman, because the version of herself required was not the careful, methodical strategist who read reports and filed documentation and made responsible choices backed by independent counsel. It was something harder and less comfortable and more alive. She looked out the window. She decided. The files on Richard Blackwell arrived at 11 that night in a locked case that Marcus set on her desk without ceremony and left without explanation. Charlotte opened it. There were 3 folders inside, physical documents, not digital, which told her something about the nature of the information before she'd read a word. Vincent's world operated on servers and encrypted channels for ordinary business. Paper meant the kind of intelligence that couldn't afford a data trail. She read for 4 hours. Richard Blackwell was 63 years old and had been a structural presence in the city's criminal economy since his mid-30s, when he had inherited a mid-tier operation from a father who had built it through construction fraud and labor intimidation and turned it into something considerably more sophisticated. He had spent 30 years expanding laterally, not deeper into violence, which drew attention, but wider into legitimate business structures that gave him the same access and insulation that Vincent's organization provided without the overhead of maintaining an enforcement apparatus. He was, in the language Charlotte understood best, a holding company with a criminal balance sheet. He was also, she discovered on page 14 of the second folder, the silent investor behind a real estate development consortium that had bid unsuccessfully 3 years ago for a waterfront property that the Moreau Group had subsequently acquired. She sat back. The loss of that bid had cost Blackwell approximately $40 million in projected development revenue. More than that, it had cost him the specific property, which sat at the intersection of 2 rezoning corridors that would triple in value over the next decade. Vincent's acquisition had not been aggressive. He hadn't undercut or maneuvered. He had simply been there first, with better financing and faster execution. Blackwell had been waiting ever since. She went to the third folder. The engagement party appeared on page 3. Not by name, by date, location, and a terse notation that read, "Incident arranged through third-party contractor, objective disruption, and asset displacement." The language was bureaucratic and bloodless, and made her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with shock and everything to do with the specific nausea of understanding that you were a variable in someone else's equation before you knew the equation existed. Asset displacement. She had been the asset, moving her from Ethan's orbit, where she was simply a woman with a broken engagement, into Vincent's, where she became a liability that Blackwell could weaponize. She closed the folder. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and breathed through the particular coldness of realizing how precisely you've been handled. Then she picked up her pen and started writing. She was at Vincent's office door at 7 in the morning. He was already there. She was beginning to understand that he kept hours that suggested sleep was something he treated as a scheduling inconvenience rather than a biological requirement. He looked up when she came in and took in the fact that she was wearing the same clothes as the previous day, which she had not gone home to change, and he did not comment on it. She put 3 pages of handwritten notes on his desk. Blackwell wants the waterfront property, she said. Not this organization, not you, the property. She pointed to the second page. He's been building toward a forced sale scenario. If he can destabilize the Moreau Group's legitimate holdings sufficiently, board fractures, investor withdrawal, public credibility collapse. The property goes into a liquidation pool, and he acquires it through a shell consortium at distressed valuation. Vincent was reading her notes. His face was still. The board members, she said, Harlan and DuPont. Look at their outside investment structures. He looked up. I don't have access to that yet, she said, but I'm guessing one or both of them has an interest in the shell consortium. Blackwell doesn't buy loyalty. He structures it, gives people a financial reason to want the outcome he wants, so they're not taking his orders, they're following their own money. Vincent set down the pages. If you're right, then the board hearing wasn't just Fane being vindictive. It was a step in a larger sequence. She pulled out the notation she'd found the previous night. He had this planned before the engagement party. He knew I'd end up here, or someone like me would. He needed a person inside your operation he could attach a scandal to. He needed you specifically, Vincent said. The Aldridge connection. He built the Aldridge connection. She heard the flatness in her own voice. Or he found it and decided it was useful and arranged the rest around it. Someone steered me toward that engagement party. Ethan's firm had 3 different venue options for that event. They chose that building. She paused. Ethan's firm receives consulting referrals through a third-party broker. I'd be willing to bet that broker has a connection to Blackwell's network. The room was very quiet. Vincent stood up slowly. He moved around the desk, not toward her, just away from the chair, the way a person moves when a space becomes insufficient for what they're thinking. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment. He used your sister, Vincent said. Charlotte's jaw tightened. Possibly. Or my sister and Ethan were already happening, and Blackwell simply used the timing. She paused. It doesn't matter which. It matters to me, he said. She looked at his back. Something in the set of his shoulders had a quality she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled stillness she'd come to read as his default. Something with more heat in it. The specific tension of a man who is deciding whether to let himself be angry or to use the anger. What matters, she said carefully, is what we do next. He turned around. His eyes had a different quality this morning. The calculating patience she'd cataloged over weeks was still there, but underneath it something had shifted, like a temperature change, not dramatic, but absolute. There's a meeting, he said, annual. The significant families, a term that means something specific in this city, and the significant legitimate interests associated with them. It's in 9 days. I know about it, she said. It's in the files. Blackwell will be there. Yes. He's going to use it. Vincent's voice was level. The story is already circulating. The board hearing results will be known by then. He'll present it as evidence that the Moreau Group is unstable, leadership fracture, a marriage of convenience with a woman under ethical investigation, a senior executive forced out under questionable circumstances. He'll propose himself as a stabilizing acquirer, Charlotte said, the waterfront property in particular. And he'll have support, because the people in that room respect strength, and they interpret instability as weakness, and weakness as an opportunity. He paused. He'll have had 9 days to work those relationships. Then we use the 9 days better than he does. Vincent looked at her. How? She had thought about this through the early morning hours, working through it the way she worked through a restructuring problem. What do you actually have? What does the other party need to believe? Where is the leverage? The audit, she said. Sandra Vale's report. When does it complete? She told me end of this week. We need it in 5 days, and we need it complete. Not a summary, the full documentation. She moved to the desk and picked up her notes. Fain's report showed a 3-year performance gap. What they didn't show, because the data was filed in a way designed to obscure it, was that the underlying business was sound. The logistics division, the hospitality properties, the financial services structure, they're performing below capacity because of management failure, not structural failure. You're sure of that? 90%. She looked at him. I need access to 3 more sets of files to get to 100. You'll have them by noon. And I need to talk to Iris Chow, today. I'll arrange it. She nodded. She turned to go. Charlotte? She stopped. He was looking at her with that expression she'd seen in the car yesterday, the one that had stopped being calculated. Are you all right? The question landed in an unexpected place. She stood with it for a moment, honestly assessing. No, she said, but I'll be functional by 9. Something moved across his face. Not pity, something with more respect in it than pity ever managed. Good, he said. That's enough. The next 5 days were the kind of work that doesn't feel like work, because the urgency metabolizes the exhaustion before it can settle. Charlotte slept 4 hours a night and ate when Marcus put food in front of her and moved through the files with the focused tunnel vision of someone who has stopped managing their emotional state and started simply operating. Iris was a precise and thorough collaborator. She arrived each morning with documentation organized by date and category and had the valuable quality of saying exactly what she knew and nothing beyond it. Charlotte had worked with people who filled uncertainty with confident extrapolation, and she had learned to discount them systematically. Iris said, I don't know, with the same composure. She said, here's what I found, and it made everything she said reliable. On day 3, they found it. Not the logistics gap, that was already documented. What Iris had not previously connected, because she had not had access to the Moreau Group's external partnership files, was a pattern in the hospitality division's underperformance that was not management failure. It was active interference. 3 of the hospitality division's largest venue contracts, the kind that drove 60% of the division's revenue, had been lost over the past 2 years to a competing company called Harrington Event Group. The losses were on price each time. Harrington had come in lower, reliably, with quotes that should not have been sustainable given market costs. Charlotte pulled Harrington Event Group's incorporation filings, shell registration in Delaware, parent company in a holding structure that took 4 layers to trace. On the 5th layer, a silent partner listed only as a numbered company incorporated in a jurisdiction that Charlotte recognized immediately as one of 3 that Blackwell's network used consistently, according to the files Vincent had given her. Harrington Event Group was Blackwell's. He had not just been waiting for the Moreau Group to destabilize, he had been accelerating it, poaching contracts, bleeding revenue, creating the appearance of a company in organic decline while the decline was being engineered from outside. She brought it to Vincent at 11 at night on day 3. He read the documentation in 7 minutes. He set it down. He picked it up and read the last 2 pages again. Then he said a word quietly that she chose not to remember. How long, he said. The pattern starts 26 months ago. She pointed to the first contract loss. 6 months after the waterfront acquisition. He stood up from the desk and walked to the window again. This time he stayed there longer. He's been inside my revenue for over 2 years, he said. Yes. And I didn't see it. She didn't answer that because the answer was complicated, and this was not the moment for complicated. The board members, she said instead. Harlan's personal investment portfolio. I need to know if he holds a stake in Harrington or the parent company. Vincent turned around. Getting that requires, I know what it requires. She held his gaze. Can you get it? He looked at her for a moment. The question was not really about Harlan's portfolio. It was about what kind of methods she was prepared to accept, and they both understood that. Yes, he said. Then get it. He reached for his phone. Harlan's investment records arrived at 6 the next morning. He held, through 2 nominees, a 4.7% stake in the Harrington Event Group parent company. DuPont held 3%. Charlotte looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she began preparing the presentation for the annual meeting. The day before the meeting, Ethan called again. She almost didn't answer. She was in the middle of organizing the presentation structure, and her phone had been a series of interruptions she'd been managing by ignoring them, and his name on the screen had the quality of a word from a language she was rapidly forgetting. She answered because something in her said it was the last time she would. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice was different, not the practiced version from before, not the flatness of rehearsed contrition, something with more fear in it. "Then tell me," she said. "The engagement party." A pause. "The venue. I didn't choose it." She set down her pen. "What?" "The venue recommendation came through the firm's event coordinator. I thought it was her job. I didn't—" He stopped. "2 days ago, someone called me. A man I didn't recognize. He told me that the venue recommendation had come from a third party and that I should be careful." "Who called you?" "He didn't give a name. He said—" Ethan's voice was unsteady. "He said you were in a dangerous situation and that I should tell you what I knew." Charlotte's mind moved over this quickly. Someone in Blackwell's network having second thoughts. Or, more likely, someone in Vincent's network who had tracked the broker connection and was using Ethan as a channel to confirm it. "The event coordinator," she said. "What's her name?" "Paula Rice. She left the firm 6 weeks ago. I can't reach her." "Okay." "Charlotte, He stopped again. "I didn't know about any of it." She sat with that. She moved it around, testing its weight. "I believe you," she said finally, because she did, not because Ethan was incapable of convenient ignorance, but because the Blackwell operation had been specifically designed to use people who didn't know they were being used. That was the elegance of it. Nobody had to lie if the architecture was built correctly. "Are you safe?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Don't contact me again, Ethan." She hung up. She called Marcus. "Paula Rice, former event coordinator at Caldwell Partners. I need a current location." Marcus said he'd have it in 2 hours. He had it in 90 minutes. Paula Rice had moved to a short-term rental in New Jersey 5 weeks ago and was, according to the information Marcus received through channels he did not specify, employed by a hospitality company. Charlotte recognized immediately as a Harrington affiliate. She added it to the documentation file and kept working. The meeting was held in a building on the west side that had been many things over the years and was currently presenting as a private members club, the kind of place where the food was acceptable and the purpose was not the food. Charlotte had never been inside. She had heard it described in 3 different contexts over the past week, each description slightly different in its emphasis, and from the variations she had assembled a reasonable picture of what it was. A room where the city's layered economy, legitimate and otherwise, acknowledged its own architecture in the presence of people who benefited from maintaining it. She dressed carefully, not to impress, to be invisible in the specific way that allowed her to be heard. Dark jacket, precise cut, nothing that announced wealth or austerity. The kind of outfit that made people listen to what you said rather than categorize you before you said it. Vincent met her in the hallway outside her room before they left. He looked at her, not the assessing look of early weeks, something more direct than that. "Whatever happens in there," he said, "what you've built in the last 2 weeks, it's real. The documentation is real. That doesn't go away." She understood what he was saying, that if the meeting went wrong, if Blackwell's narrative held and the outcome was against them, what she had produced still existed. She would still have produced it. "I know," she said. "I want you beside me in that room." "I'll be there." They rode in silence. Charlotte looked at the city moving past the window and felt, in the particular way you feel the edge of something large before you're fully in it, the shape of what was coming. The room held 41 people. Charlotte counted them the way she counted anything in a high-stakes environment, quickly, categorically, noting who was positioned near whom and what those proximities communicated. She identified Harlan and DuPont within the first 30 seconds. They were separated, she noticed, which was interesting. People coordinating a strategy rarely separated at the moment of its execution unless they'd been specifically told to. Richard Blackwell was at the far end of the room. She saw him for the first time in person and found that reality, as it often did, was both more and less than expectation. He was shorter than his files had suggested. She had constructed a physical image from his history and gotten the height wrong. He was 63 and lean and had a face that had been handsome once and had moved past handsome into something more durable, the kind of face that a certain kind of power produces, where the calculation becomes part of the structure. I was talking to two men she didn't recognize. His hands were relaxed. He was not looking toward Vincent. Men who are truly confident in their position don't monitor the person they're preparing to undermine. Blackwell's relaxed posture told her he believed this was already done. She filed that. It meant he had information that made him certain. She needed to know what it was. The meeting opened with formal acknowledgments that Charlotte paid no attention to. She was watching the room, the patterns of eye contact, the small movements that indicated conversation and coalition. She was building a map of who owed what to whom before anything was said that mattered. Blackwell spoke 40 minutes in. He rose with the ease of someone accustomed to rooms like this. Not performing the ease, just having it. He spoke for 12 minutes. His presentation was thorough and measured and devastating in the specific way that well-prepared misinformation is devastating. It contained enough accurate information to make the inaccurate elements feel equally verified. He described the Moreau Group's recent instability, the board hearing, the media coverage, the departure of a senior executive, the ongoing audit, framed not as a corrective process but as a symptom, evidence that the internal structure required external examination. He referenced the waterfront property once, briefly, as an asset that required, his word, stewardship from a stable partner during a period of organizational uncertainty. He did not look at Charlotte once during the 12 minutes. It was, she understood, precisely calculated. Acknowledging her would have invited the room to engage with her as a factor. By not looking, he reduced her to scenery. She watched the room during his presentation, watched the faces, watched the small shifts in posture that indicated agreement or reservation. She had been doing this kind of reading for 12 years, and she was good at it, and what she saw gave her a specific percentage probability of the room's disposition that was not in her favor. He sat down. There was a moment of the specific quality that follows a performance. Not applause, but the social equivalent, a kind of settled approval. Vincent stood. He was a different kind of presence in a room than Blackwell. Less immediately warm, but when he spoke, the room adjusted to him rather than the reverse. He had a quality that Charlotte had tried to name several times and kept arriving at the same word, gravity. Not heaviness. The other kind. The kind that bends space slightly around itself. He spoke for 5 minutes. He covered the audit, the logistics restructuring, the current state of the organization's legitimate holdings. He was precise and calm and gave the room nothing emotional to work with, which was correct given the composition of the audience. Then he said, "I'd like to ask my wife to speak." Charlotte stood. She had prepared for 27 minutes. She had timed it. She had the documentation organized in a physical folder that she set on the table in front of her and did not open immediately, because the first thing she needed the room to understand was that she was not reading from notes. She was explaining something she understood. The Moreau Group's revenue in the hospitality division has declined 14% over 26 months, she said. Her voice was level and carried without effort. In a standard analysis, that decline would suggest internal management failure or market conditions. I'd like to show you that it's neither. She opened the folder. She had prepared 12 physical copies of the key documentation, enough for the significant parties in the room without broadcasting the presentation to everyone. Marcus distributed them. Harrington Event Group has won 11 contracts previously held by Moreau Hospitality Divisions over the same 26-month period. In each case, Harrington's bid undercut the market rate by 8 to 12%, a margin that, given their operational costs, should have been unsustainable. She paused. Let the room absorb the document. It was sustainable because Harrington Event Group is capitalized by a parent entity that does not require the hospitality division to be profitable. The parent entity's return comes not from Harrington's margin, but from the revenue displacement, moving contracts out of the Moreau Group's column and into a competitor's, accelerating the appearance of organizational decline. The room was quiet, a different quiet than it had been 30 seconds before. The parent entity, she said, traces through 4 holding layers to a silent partner whose investment patterns overlap with several other interests in this room. She did not look at Blackwell. She looked at the room. I have the documentation. She turned 2 pages in the copy in front of her. I also have the documentation of the board members whose vote at last week's hearing was material to this situation and who hold, through nominee structures, equity stakes in the Harrington parent company. She said it without heat. That documentation has been provided to an independent legal firm this morning and is being reviewed for potential securities law implications. Harlan's face did something she didn't need to watch carefully to read. DuPont's had gone entirely still. She looked up from the folder. The Moreau Group's legitimate businesses are structurally sound, she said. The performance gaps are the result of external interference and internal reporting failures, both of which are in the process of being corrected. The waterfront property is performing in line with acquisition projections and is not in any distressed condition. She closed the folder. The stewardship it requires is the stewardship it already has. She sat down. The room was very quiet. Not the settled approval quiet of after Blackwell's presentation. Something more active. The sound of a room recalculating. She did not look at Vincent. She looked at her hands, flat on the table, which were completely still, and she thought about how much she had spent to get to this moment, and whether it would be enough, and allowed herself approximately 4 seconds of that uncertainty before she put it away. Then Blackwell stood up. He had the face now of a man who has watched something go differently than it should have and is deciding in real time how to respond. The relaxed ease was still there. He was too experienced to drop it entirely, but underneath it something had shifted into a harder register. The documentation Ms. Whitmore refers to, he said, addressing the room rather than her, was assembled by a party with a clear vested interest in its conclusions. I'd suggest that any serious analysis. The documentation was assembled by Sandra Vale's auditing firm, Charlotte said. She did not stand. She said it conversationally, the way you correct a small factual error. Ms. Vale has 30 years of independent practice and no prior relationship with the Moreau Group. Her firm's engagement letter is in the materials you've received. Blackwell looked at her for the first time. She met his eyes. He had the gaze of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in a room, looking at someone who wasn't registering the appropriate response to that. She held it without difficulty, not through bravado, through the specific absence of fear that comes when you've already decided what you're willing to lose and you've made your peace with it. You're very confident, he said. I'm accurate, she said. They're different things. A sound moved through the room, not quite a reaction, something quieter. The social acknowledgement of a moment that has shifted. Blackwell's jaw was tight. He looked away from her first, not dramatically, a natural movement, the kind anyone might make. But the room noticed. These rooms always noticed. He sat down. She did not allow herself to feel anything about that for another 12 minutes. The formal portion of the meeting concluded without a vote on the waterfront property, which was a procedural outcome that the Blackwell faction had clearly not anticipated. The vote had presumably been on the agenda, supported by enough pre-meeting coalition work to pass. The documentation she'd introduced had made 3 of the swing votes unwilling to commit publicly, and without the swing votes, the faction had pulled the proposal rather than take a failed vote on record. It was not a defeat of Blackwell. It was a deferral. She understood the difference. She was standing near the edge of the room when she felt rather than saw someone approach from her left. She turned. Richard Blackwell was standing 3 feet away from her. He had a glass of water in his hand and the expression of a man conducting a cordial conversation at a social occasion, which was the expression he chose to put on it. Ms. Whitmore. His voice was lower in person than she'd imagined, more careful. You've had an eventful introduction to this city. I've been here a long time, she said. I'm only recently interesting to it. Something moved in his eyes that might have been appreciation if it hadn't been so precisely the look of someone filing information. You're very good, he said. At the documentation, the presentation, the room. He paused. Someone taught you that. 12 years of corporate restructuring. No. He shook his head slightly. The documentation you can learn. The room you can't. That's something you're born with, or you're not. He looked at her steadily. It's a pity Vincent found you first. She held his gaze. The Harrington contracts, she said. The 11 accounts. Can they be legally transferred back? He blinked. It was a small blink, but she caught it. The quarter second of recalibration that came from not expecting a practical question. You're asking me, whether this needs to go further than it already has. She said it neutrally. The documentation exists. The legal review is in process. Where it goes from here is partly a function of choices made in the next few days. He studied her. Are you offering me something? I'm telling you what I observed, she said. What you do with the observation is your business. He looked at her for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible in a way it probably wasn't usually. She had gotten under the composure, not through aggression, but through the specific disorientation of being spoken to practically by someone he'd been treating as a variable. You're not what I expected, he said. No, she agreed. I didn't expect you either. She turned and walked back toward where Vincent was standing. Her legs were completely steady. Her hands were completely still. Her heartbeat was doing something she would describe as vigorous, but it was contained and it was hers, and nobody in that room would have known it from looking at her. Vincent turned when she reached him. He read her face, not her expression, what was under it, in the quick way he'd developed over weeks of watching her work. Blackwell approached you, he said. Yes. What did he want? To take my measure, she exhaled. I think he's deciding. Deciding what? Whether to push harder or find an exit. She met his eyes. He didn't expect the documentation to be as complete as it was. He built his plan around a woman who was a liability. He's recalculating what I actually am. Vincent was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room was beginning the social dispersal of a meeting ending, conversations starting, coats being collected, the noise rising slightly. What are you? He said. She understood the question was not rhetorical. He was asking it the way she asked questions that needed real answers. Not for a performance, not for the record. Because he actually wanted to know. She thought about it for a moment. I'm the person, she said slowly, who reads the structure and finds what's wrong with it, and says so regardless of whether it's convenient. She paused. I've been that person my whole life, and I've spent most of it being in rooms where that wasn't welcome. She looked at him. I'm starting to think I've been in the wrong rooms. He held her gaze with something in his that had stopped being managed some time ago tonight. Charlotte, he said, and then stopped. I know, she said, because she did know. Whatever was behind the way he'd said her name, she knew the shape of it even without the words. We should leave, she said. Together. The room is watching us. Let them, he said. He said it quietly, without performance, without calculation. He said it the way a person says something they mean so completely that the words are almost beside the point. She felt it land somewhere specific and stay there. They left together, and the room watched, and neither of them looked back at it. In the car, the city moved past the windows in its usual way, enormous and indifferent, and Marcus drove without speaking, and the silence between Charlotte and Vincent was the kind that has weight in it, the kind that happens when something has been said that can't be unsaid, and both parties are deciding what to do with the territory. She looked at her hands in her lap. The vote didn't happen, she said, but he's not done. No, Vincent agreed. He'll restructure, find another angle. The legal review will slow him, but not stop him. She turned to look at him. We need to make the next move before he does. What's the next move? She had been thinking about it through the drive, through the exit from the room, through the handshakes, and the careful social navigation of leaving a difficult meeting with your posture intact. Ethan, she said. Vincent's expression shifted. He knew the venue was compromised, she said. He was told to tell me, which means someone in Blackwell's network is starting to put distance between themselves and the plan. She turned to face him fully. When a structure starts to fracture, the people inside it start looking for the exit that costs them least. If someone is already feeding Ethan information, they want to make a deal, Vincent said. They want insurance, she corrected, which is the same thing, but from a different direction. She paused. I need to know who called Ethan. I'll find it. Tonight. He looked at her. The car moved through an intersection, through a pool of yellow light, and in the light his face had an openness that she was still getting accustomed to. The Vincent Moreau, who appeared in the particular privacy of a car or a kitchen, or the specific hour of a difficult night, different from the Vincent Moreau who occupied a boardroom. Yes, he said. Tonight. She nodded. She turned back to the window. She was very tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind of tired that comes from operating at the edge of your own capacity for an extended period, where each thing you've handled has drawn on a reserve that doesn't fully replenish before the next thing arrives. She was also, underneath the exhaustion, something she hadn't expected. Not satisfied. The situation was not resolved. Blackwell was not finished. The legal process was ongoing, and the board members who had conflicted interests were still seated. Nothing was clean, but she searched for the word. Present. That was it. More present than she had been in the last 6 years of her life. More fully in the thing she was doing, more genuinely herself in the doing of it, than she had been in any room with Ethan, any project at Aldridge, any version of the life she'd been building, and which had been, she understood now, a life built partly for someone else's idea of her. The car pulled onto the bridge. The water appeared below, dark and cold and enormous. Vincent's hand was on the seat between them, not reaching for her, just resting. The way a person places their hand when they're not performing anything. She put her hand beside his. Their fingers were not quite touching. She did not move hers closer, neither did he, but they were there, and the distance between them was conscious, and the city moved below and around them, and Charlotte Whitmore, who had survived one night that should have destroyed her and built something in the aftermath that no one had anticipated, felt the specific weight of what was still coming. The Blackwell unfinished, the network fracturing, the documentation in a lawyer's office that would produce consequences she couldn't fully predict. And she held it without flinching, because she had discovered that she was the kind of woman who could hold things without flinching, and that discovery was worth everything it had cost. The car moved off the bridge. The dark water disappeared behind them. And somewhere in the city, Richard Blackwell was making a phone call that would determine what the next 48 hours looked like, and Charlotte needed to know what he was saying before he finished saying it. The call came at 2 in the morning. Marcus knocked twice on her door, not urgently, but with the specific rhythm she'd learned to distinguish from a routine check. She was already half awake, sitting at her desk with the Blackwell files open and a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, and she opened the door before he knocked a third time. "We have a name," he said. She followed him to Vincent's study. Vincent was on the phone when she entered. He held up one finger, not dismissive, just asking for 60 seconds. And she stood near the window and watched the dark water and listened to his half of the conversation, which was clipped and directive and ended with a single instruction she didn't catch fully. He set the phone down. "Paula Rice," he said. Charlotte turned. "The event coordinator. She's been cooperating with a federal investigation for the past 6 weeks." He said it steadily, watching her face. "Not our investigation, a pre-existing one. Securities fraud. The same SEC case that touched Aldridge." She felt the bottom of the room shift slightly. Not dramatically, the way the floor shifts in a building when something heavy passes nearby. A vibration without a source you can point to. "She was placed in Caldwell Partners 18 months ago," Vincent continued, "through Blackwell's network, as a monitor. Monitoring Ethan. Monitoring Ethan's connection to the Aldridge alumni. The SEC investigation has been building a case around the original fraud, and someone in Blackwell's network had an interest in knowing how close the investigation was getting to certain financial instruments." He paused. "When the engagement party was arranged at that venue, it was partly opportunistic. You were already in the environment, the incident was already being planned, and Paula Rice provided the logistical thread." Charlotte turned back to the window. She pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and held them there for a moment. "She called Ethan," she said. "She panicked. The federal case is moving faster than Blackwell anticipated, and she's trying to establish that she cooperated with multiple parties." Vincent moved around his desk. "She's not the source I needed. But what she told Ethan, about the venue, about the third party, that's on record with federal investigators now." Charlotte brought her hand down. She turned around. "They're building toward Blackwell," she said. "They've been building toward Blackwell for 14 months. What they've been missing is a documented connection between his financial instruments and the Harrington operation, a clean line between his investment structures and the targeted revenue displacement." Vincent set a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. "What you built in the last week gives them that line." She looked at the paper. It was a summary, 1 page, dense with figures and entity names, of the documentation she had assembled from the Moreau Group files cross-referenced with the Blackwell Network materials. "You gave this to the federal investigators," she said. "My attorney did." 40 minutes ago. He looked at her directly. With your documentation as the evidentiary anchor. She absorbed this. He'll know by morning. Yes. Then we have until morning before he decides how to respond to being cornered. Yes. She picked up the paper and read it. Not because she hadn't seen the underlying documents, she'd built the underlying documents, but because she needed to see what it looked like as a whole, assembled, the way a structure looks different from outside than from inside when you're building it wall by wall. It was clean. It was thorough. It was the kind of documentation that didn't require interpretation because it interpreted itself. The numbers and dates and entity connections formed a picture that needed no narrator. She set it back down. The board members, she said, and DuPont. The equity stakes in the Harrington parent, are those in this? Page 2, third paragraph. She turned the page, read it. They'll be approached by investigators separately. Already scheduled for tomorrow morning. She nodded slowly. Outside, the water moved the way it always moved, and the sky had the particular quality of 3 in the morning. Not dark, exactly, but a very dark blue, the color that comes just before the first gray of dawn. What happens now? She said. We wait. She looked at him. He was standing across the desk from her, jacket off, the first time she'd seen him without one in a formal context. And he looked, she found the word tired. Not weak, not diminished. The honest tiredness of someone who has operated at full capacity for an extended period and is standing at the edge of what that period was building toward. She had not, she realized, seen him tired before. He had been careful about it. He was not being careful now. Go to sleep, she said. He looked at her. There's nothing more to do tonight that isn't already in motion, she said. Go to sleep. We deal with whatever Blackwell does when he does it. He was quiet for a moment. You're telling me what to do in my own study. Yes. Something moved across his face that was close to a smile. Not quite, but the territory adjacent to it. All right, he said. He picked up the summary sheet and put it in a folder. He turned off the desk lamp. He paused at the door. Charlotte. She looked up. Thank you, he said. He said it simply, without layering it with anything. Just the words. She held them for a moment. Get some sleep, she said. He left. She stood in the dark study for another minute, looking at the water, and then she went to her room and lay down on the bed and was asleep before she expected to be. Blackwell moved at 6 in the morning, not through legal channels, not through the board, not through the media. He moved the way he'd been moving for 2 years, through structure, through the instruments he'd built to operate at one remove from himself. The Harrington Event Group filed an emergency injunction in civil court against the Moreau Group, claiming that the documentation released to the federal investigators had been obtained through improper access to proprietary business information. Charlotte read the filing at 7, coffee in hand, standing at the kitchen counter while Marcus watched her face. He's trying to get the documentation suppressed, she said. That's what our attorneys say. On what grounds? That the Harrington corporate filings you used to establish the entity connection were accessed through a commercial database that has restricted terms of use for investigative purposes. She thought about this. The database access was through the Moreau Group standard subscription. Yes, but Harrington's attorneys are arguing that the use of that subscription to build an investigative file against a competitor exceeds the terms. She set the coffee down. That's a delay tactic. Any competent judge will see that. Our attorneys agree, but an emergency injunction buys him 72 hours while it's heard. 72 hours. She moved through the implications quickly. The federal investigators had the documentation. The injunction couldn't reach what they already had. Federal evidence wasn't subject to civil suppression orders in the same way. But it could create enough legal noise to give Blackwell's attorneys time to build a narrative around contaminated process, which was not about suppressing the evidence, but about discrediting its source. Discrediting her. He's pivoting, she said. He can't stop the federal case. He's trying to make me the problem instead of the evidence. Marcus said nothing. He was watching her with the expression he wore when he had an opinion he hadn't been asked for. What? She said. There's something else, he said. From this morning. Mr. Moreau wanted me to wait until you'd had coffee. She looked at him steadily. Tell me. Ethan Caldwell was interviewed by federal investigators yesterday afternoon. Voluntary interview. Marcus put a single printed page on the counter. He provided a formal statement about the venue selection and the communications from Paula Rice. He also provided email correspondence from 18 months ago that documents the third-party broker's involvement in steering the Caldwell Partners event account. Charlotte picked up the page. She read it. Ethan, in his statement, had described in specific detail a lunch meeting with the event broker, a man named Cartwright, during which Cartwright had encouraged Caldwell Partners to move their event business to a preferred vendor list. The preferred vendors, Ethan's statement noted, had all turned out to be connected through the same management company. He had not known the significance at the time. At the bottom of the statement summary, a note from the investigator's office. Mr. Caldwell's cooperation is considered material to the ongoing investigation. She set the page down. She thought about Ethan, not the engagement party, not Madison, not the bedroom and the ring and the 6 years. She thought about a man who had been, she now understood, as much a tool in Blackwell's structure as she had been, placed and steered without understanding his own position in the architecture. This did not forgive him. The 2 years of Madison were entirely his own making, but it shifted something, moved it from the category of malice into the category of weakness, which was a different thing. Weakness, she understood. She had spent years accommodating it. She would not accommodate it again, but she could look at it without the blinding heat of pure betrayal. She put the page aside. "Where is Vincent?" she said. "On a call with the federal office. He'll be done in 20 minutes. She nodded. She picked up her coffee and went to her office and opened her laptop and began drafting a formal response to the injunction filing, not because she was an attorney, but because she knew the factual basis better than anyone and could give the attorneys the raw material to work from in a fraction of the time it would take them to reconstruct it themselves. She worked for 40 minutes. When Vincent appeared in her doorway, she had 4 pages of detailed factual notes ready to send to Prescott's office. He looked at her across the room. He looked at the pages. "Send those," he said. "Already did," she said. He came into the office and sat in the chair across from her desk. The first time he'd sat in that chair since she'd been given the office, she realized. He leaned back slightly and looked at the ceiling and exhaled, which was the most physically unguarded thing she had seen him do. "The injunction will be denied," he said. "Our attorneys are confident." "I know. The federal case is moving. Blackwell's financial exposure through Harrington is significant enough that his attorneys are already talking about cooperation terms." "I know that too." He brought his gaze down from the ceiling and looked at her. "Then why do you look like you're still working on a problem?" She held his gaze for a moment. "Because winning legally isn't the same as closing the thing," she said. "Harlan and DuPont are still on the board. The Harrington contracts are still with Harrington. The hospitality division is still 14% below where it should be," she paused. "The structure is stabilized, but it's not repaired." "That's months of work." "Yes." She held his gaze. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression had the specific quality of a man arriving at a decision he'd already made internally and was now choosing to say out loud. "Your exit clause," he said. 18 months. You have 11 remaining." She said nothing. "The contract says 18 months from signing. I'm aware." He sat forward slightly. "I'm not raising it to remind you of the option. I'm raising it because—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together briefly. "Because I want to know what you want, Charlotte, not what the contract allows. What you actually want." She looked at him. The room had the morning light coming in from the east window, the flat gold of early autumn in New York, and it landed across the desk between them and made the space feel more exposed than it usually did, the way daylight does after a long night. She thought about the question honestly. She thought about the apartment with Ethan's name on the lease and the Chicago offer she'd declined and the way she had made herself smaller, incrementally, over 6 years. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the small daily choices of a person who had decided that maintenance was the same as happiness. She thought about the last 6 weeks. The files, the boardroom, the audit. Iris Chow's documentation laid out in order by date. Sandra Vale's flat, accurate report. The moment in the meeting room when she'd set down the folder and looked at the room and spoken without apology. She thought about Vincent's hand on the seat beside hers in the car, not reaching, just present, and the distance between their fingers that had been a choice they'd both made consciously. "I want to finish what I started," she said. "The restructuring, the hospitality division, the board composition." She paused. That's what I want professionally. And personally? She held his gaze for long enough that the question was answered before she said anything. I don't know yet, she said. I know what I feel. I don't know what to do with it. He nodded once, not disappointed, not pressing, just receiving what she'd said as what it was. That's honest, he said. I'm trying to be, she said. With you. I'm trying to make that the operating principle. I know. He stood up. So am I. He left her to her work. She sat for a moment after he'd gone, her hands flat on the desk, and she noticed that the thing she felt in her chest was not the sharp, consuming anxiety that had been her emotional backdrop for 6 weeks. It was something quieter and less familiar. Something that required more space than anxiety and less management. She picked up her pen. She kept working. The injunction was denied on Friday afternoon. Harlan resigned from the Moreau Group board on Saturday morning, citing personal reasons in a letter that took 6 sentences to say nothing. DuPont lasted until Monday, when his attorneys advised him that the federal investigators had scheduled a formal interview and that voluntary cooperation required him to be in a position to characterize his board conduct as independent rather than conflicted. His resignation letter was longer than Harlan's and said even less. Vincent appointed 2 new board members in the following week. Iris Chow was one of them, which produced a reaction from the remaining board that was not unanimous enthusiasm and which Charlotte watched with the specific satisfaction of someone who has advocated for a particular outcome and seen it materialize. The federal investigation into Blackwell moved with the particular pace of federal investigations. Not fast, but irreversible. His attorneys negotiated. The terms being discussed, according to sources. Charlotte was not supposed to have access to, but did because Marcus had a relationship with an attorney whose office was across from the federal building and who owed Vincent a particular favor, included the divestiture of the Harrington Event Group and cooperation on the Aldridge-adjacent financial instruments case. The Aldridge case was the one that had followed Charlotte like weather for 14 months. She found out on a Wednesday afternoon from Greta, who called her directly. The SEC has closed the Aldridge investigation, Greta said. Full closure. The findings attributed the fraudulent implementation entirely to the client and the firm's senior director, who has agreed to a settlement. A pause. Your name is specifically cleared in the closing documents. Charlotte was in her office. The afternoon light was coming through the east window. The water was visible at the edge of the property line, gray-green, moving. She had known, intellectually, that she had done nothing wrong. She had known that the way you know your own heartbeat, so present it becomes invisible. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and having it formally, documentarily true in a way that could not be revised by someone else's narrative. She exhaled. Thank you, Greta, she said. Charlotte? Greta's voice had something in it, warmth, but also the specific care of someone who has been watching another person carry something heavy and is now watching them set it down. Are you all right? Yes, Charlotte said, and meant it, perhaps for the first time in a long time, completely. She told Vincent that evening, not dramatically. They were in the kitchen. He was making coffee with the focused attention he applied to everything, and she came in and said, The Aldridge case is closed. My name is cleared in the formal documents. And he turned around and looked at her with an expression that was not surprise. I know, he said. She blinked. When? This morning. Greta's office contacted my legal team for confirmation of the Harrington documentation we provided. He set down the coffee. I was waiting to see if you'd tell me. She looked at him. You were testing whether I'd tell you. No. He shook his head. I was giving you the right to tell me yourself. There's a difference. She stood in the kitchen doorway and thought about the difference. It was real. It mattered. It's been following me for over a year, she said. The Aldridge Association. Every time something went well, I was waiting for it to surface again. I know. I left a good job because I knew something was wrong. And for 14 months I've been living with the fact that leaving wasn't enough. That the association was still there, still available to be used by anyone who wanted to discredit me. Blackwell used it, Vincent said. Yes. And it still wasn't enough. He said it not as comfort, but as fact. Because what you built here, what you documented, what you did in that meeting room, That was more than an association from someone else's failure could override. She looked at him. He picked up the coffee and came around the counter and held it out to her. She took it. Their hands were close for a moment, not touching, but the distance between them had been shrinking in small increments over weeks, and this increment was perceptible. "Vincent," she said. "Yes." "I want to stay." She said it simply, without the professional framing she'd been using as a container for other things. Not because of the contract, not because the restructuring is unfinished, though it is, because she stopped, organized herself. Because this is the first place I've been in a very long time where the work I do is actually the reason I'm here, and because the person I'm working beside is someone She paused again, chose the word carefully. Trust. He was very still. "That's not a small thing for me," she said. "It might sound like it. It's not." "I know it's not," he said. His voice was quiet. "Charlotte, I want—" He stopped. Something moved through his expression, the specific movement of a man for whom the careful management of what he revealed was so habitual that departing from it required actual effort. "I have not told anyone in a very long time what I wanted, in the way you mean." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you now." He looked at her directly. "I want you to stay. I want—" He pressed his mouth together briefly. "I want the version of this that isn't a contract." She held that. Outside, the water was doing what it always did. The evening light was going amber through the window. She took a step forward, closed the remaining distance that had been decreasing in increments for 6 weeks. She put her hand against his face, not soft, not tentative, the way she did everything, with intention, and she felt him breathe, a specific breath, the kind that comes when something tight releases. She kissed him once, briefly, backed up one step. His eyes were open. "The contract still has 11 months on it," she said. "I'm aware. I think we should let it run." He looked at her. "Not because I need the exit clause," she said. "Because doing it right takes time, and I would like to do this right. I've done the other version, the version that was managed badly and fell apart." She paused. "I want this one to be different." He looked at her for a long moment, then, All right, she said. They stood in the kitchen in the amber evening, and the coffee went cold the same way it always did, and neither of them moved apart. In the weeks that followed, the restructuring progressed with the steady, unglamorous momentum of real work. Not the dramatic clarity of crisis, but the daily accumulation of small corrections that eventually amounted to something transformed. The hospitality division recovered 3 of the 11 Harrington contracts within the first month, as the federal investigation into Harrington's practices made institutional clients nervous about their own association with a company under scrutiny. Charlotte did not chase the remaining 8. She identified the 3 most strategically significant and focused resources there, and let the others go, because she had learned, expensively, over years, that trying to recover everything was usually a way of recovering nothing well. The logistics division's restructuring produced its first clean quarterly report 6 weeks after Gerald Fain's departure. Not spectacular numbers, solid ones, accurately filed, reflecting what was actually there rather than what the report had been built backward from. Charlotte presented it to the board in a meeting that lasted 40 minutes and produced no drama, which was the outcome she'd been working toward. A board meeting that was boring because the company was functioning. Iris Chow sat at the table for the first time as a board member and said nothing that was not precise and relevant. Charlotte watched her and thought, this is what it looks like when you put the right person where they were being ignored. The settlement arrived 3 months after the annual meeting, from the Moreau Group's original marriage contract. Charlotte's attorney forwarded it with a brief note. As agreed in the original terms, please advise on disposition. She looked at the number for a long time. It was, as the contract had promised, significant. It was the kind of number that would have changed the course of her life at 34, standing in a coat closet retrieving her jacket while her engagement party was being conducted behind her. She thought about who she had been that night, not worse than who she was now, not less competent, not less intelligent, but smaller in some way that she couldn't precisely locate, operating in a space that had been, without her fully recognizing it, defined by someone else's idea of where she belonged. She thought about Madison. She had not spoken to her sister since the engagement party. She had received, in the intervening months, 2 texts and 1 voicemail that she had listened to once, in a particular frame of mind, and had not returned. The voicemail had contained an apology, genuine sounding, though Charlotte had learned to be careful about the difference between genuine and well-constructed. It had also contained, in its final 30 seconds, something she hadn't expected: Madison's voice dropping out of the performed contrition into something flatter and more honest, saying, "I think I've been trying to take what you had because I didn't know how to want my own things. I don't know if that means anything to you right now. I'm telling you because it's true." Charlotte had played that final 30 seconds 3 times. She had not responded. But she had not deleted it. She wrote a check from the settlement amount, the full amount, a number she had once thought would be transformative, and which was now simply a number. And she directed it to a legal aid organization in the city that she had identified during the Aldridge period, when she'd been in the vicinity of federal investigations and had noticed, peripherally, the people who navigated those processes without resources or representation. She kept exactly enough for a deposit on an apartment she would never need to move into. The act of keeping it was not about the money. It was about the option to leave freely, which was different from intending to leave. She told Vincent the same evening. He listened without comment. "The settlement amount," she said. "I've redirected it." "I know," he said. "Prescott notified me." She looked at him. "And?" "And nothing." He met her eyes. "It was yours. You did what you wanted with it." She nodded. "Charlotte," he paused, "I want you to understand something." She waited. "What you've done here, the logistics division, the board, the Blackwell documentation, I would have found someone to do those things eventually. The organization would have survived." He said it directly, not to diminish what she'd built. But it would have survived the way it always has, with the same structural blindness, the same patterns. He stopped. "You didn't just fix the company. You changed how the company sees itself." She sat with that for a moment. "That's the harder thing to do," he said. "Anyone can fix numbers, changing how an organization understands itself. That takes someone who sees it from outside and isn't intimidated by what they see." She looked at him. "You're not intimidated by what you see," she said. "You intimidate other people." "That's different." Something moved in his expression. "I've been afraid of specific things my entire adult life. I'm simply careful about which ones I let become visible." This was the most she had heard him say about himself in the months since the kitchen. She absorbed it carefully, the way you handle something fragile that has been offered without ceremony. "What are you afraid of?" she said. He looked at her for a moment, a long moment, with the particular quality of someone deciding how honest to be. Not whether to be honest, but how far in to let another person. "I'm afraid of having the thing that matters most and losing it," he said. "I'm afraid of it in the specific way that people are afraid of things they've already experienced once." He paused. "I lost someone important years ago. Not romantically. My brother." A pause. "He died because of choices I made, because of what this organization is and what it demands." The room was very still. "I decided after that to make everything about the organization," he said. "Because the organization doesn't leave, doesn't get hurt because of decisions you made. The organization is a machine, and machines are predictable." Charlotte said nothing. "You are not a machine," he said. It came out with a quality she hadn't heard in his voice before. Not vulnerability exactly, but the specific register of honesty that costs something. "You are the least predictable person I have encountered in 20 years of building structures around unpredictability, and I find that I am not afraid of it in the way I expected." "What way did you expect?" "I expected to want to control it," he said. "I don't." She looked at him. He looked back. "I'll tell you what I'm afraid of," she said. "All right. I'm afraid of doing it again. Building something around another person's version of who I should be and then losing 6 years when it falls apart." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm afraid of the version of myself that makes herself smaller to fit a space. Because she's very good at it. She practiced for a long time." "I know," he said. "You need to know that I won't do that here. If I feel that happening, if the organization, or you, or anything in this structure starts requiring me to be smaller, I will tell you. And if it doesn't change, I'll leave." "I know," he said again. "Do you?" She looked at him. "Yes." He said it without hesitation. "And Charlotte, If you ever feel that happening and you don't tell me, I'll consider that my failure, not yours." She held that. It was the right thing to say. More than that, it was the thing that required someone to actually mean it, and she believed, in the specific way she believed things that had earned belief, that he did. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They sat for a moment in the quiet of the study, with the water outside doing its constant work and the city beyond it going about its enormous indifferent business, and something settled between them. Not a resolution, not a formal arrival, but the specific settling of two people who have been holding something carefully and have finally agreed to set it down. 6 months after the annual meeting, Charlotte stood in the Moreau Group's main conference room on the 14th floor and presented the completed restructuring plan to a full board. 8 members now, half of whom she had either recommended or directly supported. And the plan was adopted without a single vote against it. The plan called for the establishment of a community investment division, seeded from the organization's profit margin from the waterfront property. It called for transparent public reporting of the legitimate holdings' performance. It called for an independent ethics review board, which had been Iris's suggestion and which Charlotte had immediately recognized as the correct idea. It was not a transformation of what the Moreau Group was in its entirety. Charlotte was not naive about what the organization was or what it had been, and she did not pretend otherwise. But the legitimate businesses, the 1,800 employees, the companies that conducted their work without the benefit of criminal infrastructure, those were real. Those were worth fixing. Those were worth the 6 weeks and the board hearing and the annual meeting and the Blackwell documentation and everything it had cost. After the meeting, she stood at the floor-to-ceiling window on the 14th floor and looked at the city below. Not with the wonder of unfamiliarity. She had been in the city her whole professional life, with the specific quality of recognition that comes when a place has become yours in a new way. Not because it changed, but because you did. Vincent came to stand beside her, not close enough to be conspicuous, but close enough that the proximity was a choice. They looked at the city for a moment without speaking. "The waterfront property," she said. "What about it?" "The Community Investment Division will seed its first grant cycle from that margin in the second quarter." She paused. "Blackwell spent 2 years trying to take that property away from you because he knew what it was worth." "Yes." "He was right about what it was worth," she said. "He was wrong about how." Vincent turned his head slightly to look at her. "Meaning?" "He saw it as an asset to control, a number to acquire." She watched a cab navigate a yellow light far below. "You held on to it because it was strategically significant, but what we're doing with the margin—" She paused. "That's what makes it worth something that Blackwell couldn't have calculated. That's not a real estate asset. That's 20 years of community trust." He was quiet. "That's the part of this organization that doesn't appear on a balance sheet," she said, "and it's the part nobody could manufacture by forcing a sale." He looked at her for a moment, that thorough, unhurried look she'd cataloged over months and had stopped needing to decode because she understood now what it contained. Not the assessment of a strategist evaluating an asset, but the attention of a person who was still, continuously, choosing to be present. "You're going to change this city," he said. "I'm going to try to fix a company," she said. "That's enough." He turned back to the window. "Charlotte." "Yes." "The contract expires in 5 months." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I'm not raising it to apply pressure." "I know that too." He turned to face her fully. They were both reflected faintly in the glass of the window, the city ghosted through them. "I want to ask you something." "Then ask." He looked at her with an expression she had first seen in a kitchen at 3 in the morning and had been watching evolve over months into something she no longer needed a translation for, something direct and specific and unburdened by the calculation that had been his default language. "Stay," he said. "Not because of the organization, not because the restructuring isn't finished, though it isn't. Stay because—" He stopped, pressed forward through the stop. "Because I have not looked at this city the same way since the first morning you came down to the kitchen and told me about the logistics division before you'd finished your coffee. Because the person I am in the same room as you is better, more honest." He paused. "And because I think you know that the version of you that exists in this building is closer to who you actually are than anything you were before it." She looked at him for a long time. He was right. She had been aware of it for months, the way she moved through the Moreau group differently than she had moved through any previous environment. Not more competently, not more strategically, more fully. Like a person using all of themselves rather than the version that fit the available space. She thought about the ring on the dresser. The elevator she had not taken, Daniel on the floor, the car, the kitchen at 7 in the morning, and the contract on the table and every choice she had made since, which had felt like navigation, but which she understood now had been something more deliberate than navigation. It had been choosing. She had been choosing continuously from the moment she turned away from the open elevator. Yes, she said. He was still. Not because of the organization, she said. Not because of the contract expiring or the restructuring or any of it. She looked at him directly. Because you are the first person in a very long time who saw what I could do and moved out of the way to let me do it. And because the person I am when I'm being honest, which I am trying to be continuously, with you, is the person I want to be. She paused. You are part of why she exists now. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Something in his face, the careful management that was so habitual she had come to read it as his baseline. Released. Not dramatically, like a door opening that had been closed a long time, just a change in the quality of light. He extended his hand, not the reaching gesture of someone taking something, but the offering gesture of someone making a choice. She took it. His grip was warm and certain and unhurried, and she held it and looked back out the window at the city, which was continuing its enormous business without acknowledging them, which was as it should be, because what was happening in this room was not for the city's benefit. It was for theirs. Months later, Charlotte sat in her office in the East Wing. Her office, definitively, in a way it had been building toward for nearly a year, and she received an email from Madison. She almost moved past it. Her hand was on the mouse, and she felt the reflexive resistance of someone who had been protecting themselves from a particular direction for a long time. She opened it. It was short. Shorter than any of the previous communications, which had been long the way. Apologies are long when they carry guilt that needs distributing. This one was 3 sentences. I got a job. Social work. I start next month. I don't need anything from you. I just thought you should know I'm trying. Charlotte read it twice. She thought about Madison at 22, picking up Charlotte's things and carrying them because Charlotte needed to get somewhere and couldn't carry everything herself. She thought about Madison at 28, at a family dinner, asking Charlotte why she looked tired in a way that had contained, Charlotte now believed, more observation than criticism. She thought about Madison at 31, making choices that were terrible and that Charlotte would not excuse, and that had also come, she suspected, from the specific hopelessness of a person who believed the only way to have what they wanted was to take it from someone who already had it. She did not respond immediately. She sat with the 3 sentences for a long time. Then she wrote, "Good, keep going." She sent it. She closed the laptop. She sat for a moment in the morning light, in the office that had become hers through the accumulation of work and honesty, and the specific courage of showing up continuously to a situation that had asked more of her than she had planned to give. Outside, the water moved. The city went on. She picked up her pen. She kept working.